Monumentale Kunst und Industriebau, lecture by Walter Gropius mit Lichtbild, all with light photographs. 8 p.m. 1 Mark, Folkbank Museum, Hagen, 1911. In a poster similar to this one, the Folkbank Museum, directed by art collector Karl Ernst Osthaus, promoted what was going to be Walter Gropius' first ever public lecture, and without any knowledge, the first ever public dissemination of the now iconic photographs of American silos within architectural discourse. These photographs were the last of a series of 69 examples or illustrations, in Gropius' words, that were projected and along with his voice performed after 1 hour of rhetoric argumentation on what he believed was the new monumental style. Most of the scholarly research on the subject has either emphasized the question of the image's provenance or examined the relationship between what they claim was the original dissemination media, the 1913 Werkbund yearbook, where Gropius used them as illustrations for his article Development of Modern Industrial Architecture, and their posterior history of repeated publication, interpretation, and debate, as for instance in the works of architectural historians such as Bruno Taut in 1929, which is the one above, or Peter Reina Banham in 1986. But as well in the writings of architects such as Le Corbusier, which is the most famous one, in 1923, and the Canadian architect Melvin Charney in 1967. In this paper, I aim to illustrate to you how Walter Gropius' use of Lichtbild, or light images, supported the argument that he, for the first time, was socializing that night. Based on a close reading of the original lecture manuscript, which indicates that images and text were merged in performance, I will argue that it is the agency of the projector that enables the foundation of these iconic buildings, architectural criticism. A criticism that actually takes place in the ephemeral space of the projection rather than in the various printed media where it's usually located. The lecture room where Gropius performed occupied a special place within the Folkbank Museum. Designed by the Berlin-based architect Peter Behrens in 1905, it contrasted to the museum's interior design, previously commissioned to the Belgian architect Henry van der Velde. These are some photographs of the interior. I apologize for the quality. These are photographs of the time, so they're a bit. As well as to the building neo-Gothic exterior designed by the also Berlin architect Karl Gerhard. Before the lecture started, approximately 24 attendees sat on the semicircular wooden stall designed by the German sculptor Rudolf Bosselt that faced the two entrance wooden doors. The lecture's podium stood possibly on the right. In the center, and this is all speculation based solely on photographic evidence, a table with the Leica Skepticon and a wooden box with 69 glass lights were waiting to be projected onto the rectangular canvas-like fabric that in a dismountable wooden frame stood on the left facing the audience. This was the Skepticon that Gropius used that evening. Under the dim light of the chandelier and the warmth of the open fire chimney, Karl Ernst Osthaus introduced his invited lecturer, Walter Gropius, promising young architect who, together with his office partner Adolf Meyer, was then working for Karl Benscheidt on his Fagus factory complex. The lecture then would reveal the audience a rigorous study on the purposes of design and contemporary industrial buildings. With you, Walter Gropius and the Monumental Art and Industrial Building. This is Gropius at the time, more or less. For the purpose of this paper, it is important to mention that Gropius' lecture was divided in two parts. The first one responds to 17 imageless typewritten pages, and the second one constitutes a series of 69 images and their corresponding captions that act as illustrations for his argument. Both parts, and as the title of the lecture suggests, are divided at the same time in two. The first one on monumental art, and the second on industrial building. While the second part establishes the relationship between industrial design and production by touching upon the changes that needed to be done in reforming factory design and in enhancing the social performance on architecture in that field, for this conference purpose, today I will only concentrate in the initial part, the one that frames the discussion of industrial buildings as precursors of a new monumental style, and this is the important part, a new building art that, in Gropius' word, was so far lacking necessary ethical or religious foundation. Gropius' first definition of monumentality, which is the main aim of an industrial building, appears in the second page of the lecture's manuscript. And I translate. A new blossom of a new monumental building art will begin from the huge tasks that technology and industry of today demand. Utility, purposiveness, and social performance were consequently preconditions for what Gropius designated as the new monumental style, but also preconditions of the general nature of monumental art, which he continues partially followed the art historical concepts initially formulated by art historians Alois Siegel and Willem Bohringer, whose quest for monumentality, deriving from empathy theory, involved abstracting and psychologizing historical styles into simple, massive, and geometric forms capable to evoke powerful emotions. Furthermore, the new monumental style would not be complete without the power of the genius, or the artist, as only the genius creates truly monumental artwork which can continuously influence all other art expressions. And that was Gropius' quote. In his discourse on monumentality, there is one particular notion that appears as a mandatory prerequisite, and that is, in my opinion, not only where Gropius' central argument is, but also where the core of the argument for this paper lies. It is in the notion of corporeality. In German, Körperlichkeit, word which, in according to late 19th century aesthetic discourses, necessarily implied a distinction between materiality and immateriality and mass and lightness. It is here where the inclusion of the silos finds justification, and also where the projection of the images finds their validation. The reason why I would like to emphasize this particular notion is because in this lecture, I believe there are two corporealities. The first one resulting from Gropius' argumentation and its relation to monumentality, and the second one, and possible only through the projector's agency, is the one I will refer to as the corporeality of the image. The first one is a condition of Gropius' new style, and the second one is the one which allows materializing Gropius' idea of corporeality for the audience's eyes. In order to locate Gropius' notion of corporeality and its imperative relation to monumentality, I will necessarily refer briefly to the discussion of the perceptual characteristics of mass and the hesitancy of iron as a medium of architectural expression rooted in the late 19th century. Discussion that took place not only within architects and engineers, but mainly with art historians. A good source that summarizes this debate is Georg Hauser, editor of the Deutsche Bauästhetik Journal, who in 1890 wrote, "The expression of the compartmented style changes as follows. First, if the web, and by web they mean structure, consists of the lattice and rod system that characterizes the iron style, then we have an invisible architecture. Second, if the web is a thin but generally enclosing wall, then we have a bodiless, materially weak, yet very visible architecture, even in iron. Third, if the web is massive in whatever material, then we have a corporeal, monumental architecture. In words of the historian Karl Schefflers, the line means nothing in architecture, mass means everything." Clearly informed by these contemporary discussions and drawing upon these two sources, that evening Walter Gropius read, "A purely constructed iron bridge, the naked result of recent engineers' calculation, is in many cases a fleshless, bodiless line structure without light and shadow." And I would like to emphasize light and shadow. "If the construction of such a bridge is concealed with wood or sheet metal, then the statistically mathematical calculation would not be changed in essence, but in the optical image, the eye would be offered the illusion of a powerful corporeality which had missed before. What strong role the illusion of corporeality plays in the sensual feeling, when, for instance, one hangs in front of the open railing of a highly located balcony, opaque paper, or a canvas. I will now introduce you to the second notion of corporeality, what I have called the corporeality of the image. And these are images from Walter Gropius' Diapo-Sammlung. Maybe you recognize the, I'm sorry, the contrast is horrible. Well, this was the, I think it's silo number 1 or 2 here in Montreal, the one that was demolished recently, or some years ago, which was part of his discourse. As you might be familiar with, a glass slide consists of an image supported on a glass base with a cover glass to protect then the surface of the image and usually held together with cloth tape. Although glass slides could be done from paper prints, Gropius slides are photographic images and produced as duplicates from original composite negatives, which generally were printed into the slide either by contact printing process, which replicates the process of photographic development but on glass, or by optical, which replicates the process of photographic projection onto a surface. This one you can see a little bit better. In both cases, the result is a series of black patterns enriched and heightened by the use of substances such as phosphate of soda, where every solid element, in this case trusses, webs, or masses and surfaces, were rendered as black, and where transparency, which will allow light to go through, would in contrast denote the absence of solid material. As in any photographic negative, the combination of black and gray patterns enhanced any volumetric characteristic, and in such a way defined the object when projected. But different to any printed photograph, in the case of the Lichtbild, light penetrates it at first, then transports it and duplicates it. When projected, it has the power to transform buildings or works of art into illuminated reproductions that at the same time are subjected into a series of alterations in terms mostly of scale and color, but also texture, frame, and context. It was Hermann Grimm, Wolfling's professor and predecessor in art history at the Humboldt University in Berlin, who had pointed out this in 1892, while being one of the first ones to introduce the use of glass slides into the German context, in an environment which might have looked similar to this one. For Grimm, this pictorial mechanics is not about illusion, deception, or simulation, but about effective, functional, and good enough transparency that productively enabled new artistic aspects to appear. And it was the Sciopticon, the earliest form of mineral oil lantern, the projection device that allowed him to do so. For Grimm, the lantern slides allowed reducing most contextual information of the work of art projected, and due to the immediacy of the photograph, enabled to address directly what is to be seen, effectuating a new mode of looking, I quote him. In Gropius' case, is this new mode of looking that was prompted by the use of Lichtbilds, and that enabled the projection technology. As I will illustrate now, it is in the second part of the lecture where the projected slide mimics the corporeality of what is being portrayed in words, conferring the image a critical dimension. I'm really sorry, this here looks fine. This is the lecture. After more than 1 hour of imageless argumentation, lights went down, so yeah. The sound of the projector might have probably invaded the lecture hall, while a white square of light appeared projected on the temporary white canvas. So I here would ask you to make an abstraction exercise and imagine the dark room and the projector sound and the images starting to appear. The lecture mode shifted from an embodied to a disembodied speech. Photographs were projected sequentially, one after the other, while Gropius' voice concealed the absence of narrative and discursive capabilities of the images themselves by giving them one himself, echoing the performances of contemporary art historians such as Heinrich Wölfing, of figures such as the film lecturer, who since the end of the 19th century was the voice behind the animated photographs. In the terms of cinema historian and theorist Germain Lacaze, Gropius' voice was not only a narrative device, but also the mediator between modernity and its projection technology that served the consolidation of scientific and materialist knowledge of the world, offering the spectator a narrative built-up by the reproduction of what he believed was the real. A real that paradoxically he had not yet been able to experience directly, and that, like his audience, was introduced through photographs. And these are photographs from engineering journals of the time where the photographs were taken from. The first image projected responded to the fortress of Coca in North Spain. While on the screen, and as a clarification of what was going to come, he read, The reason for all the following examples of modern industrial and engineering building is to find out, in as much as the corporeality or interior views of the space enclosure is meaningfully expressed. I will now stop in one of the bridges he used as an example, a bridge from Griethausen am Rhein, as he has intentionally altered the image. Well, here it's working actually, in contrast to the others. On the right side, here, of the iron structure, you can see that with the use of a color pen, he sketched a surface over the iron bridge. So this black part was drawn by Gropius over the photograph, to illustrate how much stronger the architectonic expressions would be if the builder would have used a simple cladding over the truss. He reads, instead of a network of numberless steel beams through which the eye can see through, which is on the left, on the right, sorry. On the eye can see through would be, aesthetically speaking, the impression of a simple corporeal beam created, and at the same time, the eye of the passenger would be allowed a spatial stop, rest, hold. What I would like to point out here is how, while these words were being read, the light of the projector transversed the Lichtbild, materializing on the screen Gropius' words, and in that way mimicking Gropius' arguments. In other words, after the light filtered through the glass light, it penetrated the empty spaces of the bridge as the beams through which the eye can see through, while not being able to do so where were shadows or surfaces, as emphasized by Gropius' alteration on the left. In a cinematic form concerned with communicating a narrative, as in Laszlo Moholy-Nagy's words, or in Christian Metz's formulation of the vividness of the photographic sequence, of a being there of the film as opposed to Barth's having been there of the photograph, more reinforced bridges appeared one by one. Examples of different countries started to frame his discussion on the importance of light that transversed the shadow and that rendered overall pointing to the importance of corporeality and monumentality. This notion was further developed in other images, such as the French torpedo experimental ponton in ferroconcrete, where, I quote him, conscious collaboration of an artist or the unconscious correct feeling of an engineer achieved an enclosed corporeality for the expression of the building. This in clear opposition with other structures such as the Zeppelin and train halls, such as this image, where he points out, through the tent ceiling, the daylight enters the space diffusely. The roof is therefore aesthetically ignored. Example after example, he stages a discussion that in the end will lead to the climax, the concrete grain elevators as the example of the new monumental style. But before arriving to them, reference to factory complexes, this by Hans Polzig and this by Peter Behrens, were necessarily brought in as examples of how exemplary monumental buildings also provided common work spirit that enhanced production and that prevented the social catastrophe of the capitalist system of production. At the end, a few silo buildings from Germany and America. He reads, it is in this moment where the paradigmatic images of the silos are introduced, and one after the other projected. Only two explanatory indications were made. One, to make a reference to the unfortunate proportion of the corn silo in Bremen, which is this one, and a brief reference to the Dakota elevator's power corporeal effect, which is this one. Only one adjective described the size as gigantic, in this case. Another one to describe the material nature, unfinished. One short but significant remark. Apparently, an artist has contributed. To conclude, not many words accompanied the images. At this stage, there was no need. The argument was being made aided by the agency of the projector and its projected Lichtbilds, whose projected shadows embodied the corporeal, or the volumes in black, and the light rays, the invisible. In other words, Gropius' quest for a new monumentality was self-evidenced in the materialized corporeality of the silos on the screen due to the dematerialization of the photograph in light and shadow. When finishing his lecture, Gropius read, the performed series of images makes no claim for completeness, but maybe with it, nevertheless, the evidence is provided. It is his understanding of the performed image where the projected image mimics the read argument, only due to the specificity of the demonstrative buildings as Lichtbild, that allowed light to go in particular ways, and thus making of the image and the argument one and the same. This would not have happened with other buildings, I guess. After all, it was not only a red lecture, but a projection event, which in effect, as the equivocal character of the word projection reveals, is tied to the luminous transport of images, but also to the representation of volumes on a flat surface. Gropius' lecture evokes what Peggy Phelan has termed representation without reproduction, as it destabilizes the possibility of thinking of photography as a repetition media, but also allows thinking of photography as a spatial practice, where the ephemeral and narrated luminous image, with its characteristic of appearing and disappearing while looking at it, was constant and alive, giving the photographic document the quality of an event. As cinema theorist Dominic Piney claimed, since the projection of the image mixes in a single composite the image and the light necessary for its exhibition, it's therefore, image for its exhibition in its dialectical nature is associated as representing and exhibiting. Image light, image text, dialectical image. Projection equally confers on the image a critical dimension. While the 1913 Werkbund yearbook article, the Silos photographs illustrated Gropius' argument, in this 1911 lecture, they embody, materialize, and predominantly are the argument.